smalketa. Oy boy chala, boy chala, boy chala. Ay, Shabbos smalketa. Boy beshalom ateres bala, gam besimcha u'tala. Toy chemone am segula, toy chemone am segula. Boy chala, boy chala, boy chala. Ay, Shabbos malketa. Boy l'shalom. Good evening. What a beautiful song. Boi b'shalom. Enter in peace. We sing that on Friday nights as we welcome Shabbos. And we have this wonderful image of Shabbos. The Sabbath is a bride, right? It's the bride of the Lord. And we welcome the Sabbath bride. In fact, there were times in the past when we would go out into the fields. This was a mystical practice of the Kabbalists in the northern city of Sfat in Israel, to go out into the fields and to sing and to speak and to meditate and to welcome the Sabbath bride who's coming to town, to welcome that peace that descends on all of us as Shabbos arrives. Beautiful song, Boi v'Shalom by Shlomo Katz. Let's light up the darkness. I am so excited that Shabbos is almost here. Tonight's class, and then tomorrow afternoon, noon Pacific, and then Shabbos comes. It comes in so early in the winter. It's crazy. So it's a big rush on Fridays. But man, Shabbos is almost here. Who is with us on this lovely Thursday evening as we gather to do a little learning? Melissa from Great Neck, Stephen from New Hampshire, Sandy from Michigan, Linda. Not sure what you're saying, but welcome, Linda. Lucy from Minnesota, Chaim from Charlotte, Anne from Merced in California, Yehuda from South Carolina, Rochelle from Modesto, Bill with us from Arkansas, Judith in Arizona, Patrice in Utah, Leah in Florida, John in Florida, Brinna says Erev Tov, good evening. I know she's in Massachusetts. Paula in Chicago, James in Indianapolis, Jim says Shalom from Cape Coral, Florida, and Paul from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Welcome, everybody. Oh, and Neil from Virginia. Haven't seen you in a while on the YouTube side. Welcome. Great to see you with us. Okay. We've got some work to do. We are completing our discussion of chapter 9 here in Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're on page Tzadi Hey, that's page 95, completing the fifth and final Mishnah here of chapter 9. And we're going to open our discussion of the first Mishnah in chapter 10, the final chapter here in Tractate Eruvin. There's going to be a lot of Mishnayos here in chapter 10. There's 19, in fact, to cover in the next 10 pages. We've only got 10 pages left here in Tractate Eruvin. And that means that between the 150 pages of Tractate Shabbos and the 105 pages of Tractate Eruvin, which is really all about the laws of Shabbos. It's 250 days that we've been studying Shabbos, but in 10 days it comes to an end. And then actually the next tractate is about Passover, about Pesach, called Pesachim. So here we go. We're getting into that home stretch. And what's nice is here, this final Mishnah of chapter 9, it's about eruv, but it's unusual. It's two teachings of Rabbi Yehuda that were overruled by the sages, by the other sages. And it's almost like, why did Rebbi, the compiler of the Mishnah, kind of throw in this final Mishnah with these two rulings that were overruled of Rabbi Yehuda? What they have in common is that they're by Rabbi Yehuda. They're not really on the same body of law. And so that's interesting, kind of throwing it in at the end there. It's sort of like Rebbe's great respect for Rabbi Yehuda, that these teachings shouldn't be lost, even though they didn't become the law. And then when we go into chapter 10, it's going to be great. Like we've been talking about eruv for so long. Chapter 10 is not about eruv. In fact, it's going to be about the intersection of Shabbos and Tefilllin. Tefillin, in English phylacteries, but Tefillin are the black leather straps that a Jewish man dons every day. I've got my Tefillin right here, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let's get into it. First, this final Mishna of chapter 9. Let's read it. So, Mishnah number 5 here of chapter 9. With regard to one who builds an upper story atop two houses on opposite sides of a public domain. So what he's actually saying is that there's buildings on either side of a busy street, right? So there's a public domain. It passes between these two buildings on either side of the street. And then somebody builds a house over the street that connects the buildings on either side of the street. You actually see this from time to time, like a passageway through the sky between, sometimes there's like a pair of skyscrapers that go together, and there's an overhead, sort of skyway, or there's some famous bridges that aren't just bridges, but there's a bunch of, stores and even residences on the bridge. And so in this case, just imagine a house built over a road and spanning buildings on either sides of the road. We're actually going to get such a structure here in Los Angeles in a few years. The LA County Museum of Art has been a lot of it has been torn down, and it's going to be rebuilt, and it's going to go over Wilshire Boulevard. So imagine that. Imagine a building, in this case, a residence that is over a public street. So, with regard to one who builds an upper story atop two houses over the public domain, and likewise bridges that have a public thoroughfare running under them. There's an illustration here. It's a little bit hard to see, but just imagine a bridge with arches that goes across a river. But at the river's edge, the bridge is still pretty high above the ground, and there's one more archway over the bank of the river, and there's a road there. So there's a public thoroughfare that runs beside the river, and it goes under the bridge, right? So a public thoroughfare that goes under a bridge. With regard to these two situations, a house or a bridge over the public domain, Rabbi Yehuda says you can carry on Shabbos when you're under that structure, under the bridge or under the house. And the rabbi on Shabbos, right? Why? Because this apparently, according to Rabbi Yehuda, this structure overhead, and we're going to see it's a one reason or the other, but this structure overhead, either because walls on either side or the roof, the sort of roof over us that is this building, somehow is going to create a private domain, even in the middle of a public domain, even a public thoroughfare. Underneath the house or the bridge is going to be like a private domain, and so it's permissible to carry objects there on Shabbos. And furthermore, right? So this is from the title of today's show. So this word, and furthermore, ve'od, right? So ve'od, and furthermore, Rabbi Yehuda said one may establish an eruv even for an alleyway that is open at both ends with no need for any additional measures, and the rabbis prohibit doing so. The rabbis say no to Rabbi Yehuda with respect to carrying under a bridge or a house that is over a public thoroughfare, and the rabbis say no to Rabbi Yehuda that carrying is going to be permitted in an alleyway that is open on both ends. This is actually the first thing we studied here in Tractate Eruvin when we have an alleyway. And remember that an alleyway is a particular thing, meaning that multiple courtyards, each courtyard has multiple houses in it where they create an eruv inside the courtyards, and then these courtyards open into the alleyway. And then can we merge the alleyway so that carrying is permitted in the alleyway and someone can carry from one courtyard to another? Yeah, there can be a merging of the alleyway, a merging of the courtyards through the alleyway. But when we do that, we're always talking about an alleyway that is a dead end, a three-sided alley. It opens on one end out to the public thoroughfare. Then along the length of it, okay, there's multiple courtyards that open into it. And at the other end, it's closed. It's not a street that has two ends. We saw that you can make an eruv in an alleyway that is open on both ends, but you have to do more than for a three-sided alley. With a three-sided alleyway, all you have to do is put a side post or a crossbeam at the opening of it. But if it's open on two ends, the side post and crossbeam still necessary on one end. But on the other end, you have to do something much more substantial in order to render this alleyway a place where people can carry on Shabbos. Namely, you have to create a door there. It can be the form of a door, right? You don't have to actually close it with a wall and put a door in the wall. But you can create the form of a door with two side posts and a crossbeam. A much more substantial structure is going to be required at one end than at the other in order to render that alleyway permissible for carrying on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda says you don't have to do that. The rabbis say to Rabbi Yehuda, no, you're wrong. You do have to do that. So why did Rebbi, who compiled the Mishna, at the end of chapter 9 here, had these two teachings of Rabbi Yehuda? What they have in common is that it's Rabbi Yehuda, and that in both cases it's a minority opinion that was overruled by the other rabbis. So why? Why is it here? What are we meant to learn? The two questions that are asked, right? So this private domain, right? So Rabbi Yehuda is saying that if we're under the house that's built over the road or under the bridge that passes over the road, he says it becomes a private domain. The rabbis say it doesn't. Based on what is he saying that it becomes a private domain under this structure? Now, we've had some ideas recently, some concepts that we can apply to this now that we know more, right? We've been learning together for a while. What might it be that is going to render carrying permitted under this structure? There's two possibilities. Either it's because this is acting as a roof overhead, and we've had the concept that the edge of a roof descends and seals, right? So when we have a roof, even though there's no wall there, right, this is going to be a two-sided structure because you're under the house, and you can imagine that when you're under it, the house spans two buildings. So the buildings, you definitely have two sides of this domain, but you don't have four sides. You only have two sides. But the opening, because the road passes underneath this house, right? It connects two buildings on either side of the street. So you've got the buildings are two walls. And then as you pass through, you don't have a first wall and a second wall. But the edge of that structure could be considered like the edge of a roof that descends and seals. So it's as if we have four walls. And then a private domain, needs to be enclosed. And so it seems like, okay, it would be enclosed at least through this legal fiction. Is that what renders carrying permitted under the house or the bridge? Or is Rabbi Yehuda saying that actually two sides of a private domain are enough? Maybe that's what he's saying. Rabbah says, Rabbi Yehuda does not hold that two partitions are enough to define a private domain where carrying is going to be permitted on Shabbos. Rather, he's saying it's the concept of the edge of the roof, right? And so the bridge overhead or the house overhead, we can imagine that its two outer edges descend, and it's like they act as partitions, and therefore we have four sides around this area that we can carry in. Abaye says, well, not so fast. Because we had a baraisa, and you might recall that we learned this together, where Rabbi Yehuda said, if you have a situation similar to this, where one person owns two houses on either side of a public thoroughfare, right? So he has two homes, and they're on opposite sides of the street. Now, for this person, it would be quite handy to be able to carry objects on Shabbos from one of his houses to the other house. He would like to carry objects, maybe, he'd like to carry some food from one house to the other. Now, there's a public thoroughfare between the two houses. So there's no way to make an eruv like the way you would if two houses occupied a shared courtyard. It's the public thoroughfare between them. But we had a ruling from Rabbi Yehuda in that baraisa that if he has two houses on either side of the street, he just puts a side post next to the house on one side of the street and another side post next to the house on the other side of the street. And with that, it's like he's creating a mini private domain just on that block between his two houses. And the rabbis said no to Rabbi Yehuda. In order to permit carrying in a public domain, you have to seal off that block. You're going to have to make the form of a door actually on both sides, because this is not an alleyway that's open on two ends. This is the public thoroughfare itself. And so you're going to have to make a form of a door at each end connecting the two houses in order to be permitted to carry from one house to the other across the public thoroughfare. That's what the rabbi said to Rabbi Yehuda then. But based on Rabbi Yehuda's holding in that baraisa, Abaya is saying, well, Rabbi Yehuda obviously does hold that two partitions, one on each side, can define a private domain, and all you need is just that side post to indicate that one is taking that action. So it's not that we can learn from this Mishna that we're studying together that Rabbi Yehuda believes that the edge of the roof descends and seals. Rabba answers Abaye and he says, well, from the baraisa that you're bringing, right, it would seem that Rabbi Yehuda holds that two sides, two partitions are enough to define a public domain, a private domain. But from the Mishnah that we are discussing right now, we cannot conclude that. And we're not going to conclude what Rabbi Yehuda holds just based on that one baraisa. And then Rav Ashi steps in, and Rav Ashi is one of the compilers of the Talmud, right? So he is going to have the final word on this discussion. And Rav Ashi says we have to read the Mishnah precisely, right? There's two holdings here of Rav Yehuda. The first is that you can carry underneath this bridge or house suspended in the sky, in the air between two houses over a public thoroughfare, and furthermore, we can make an alley into a place where we can carry with just a side post. Now, the second one, clearly, there's no roof involved, so Rabbi Yehuda must hold that two sides of can form a private domain. You don't need three sides as a minimum in order to imply the fourth. And really, you need four sides. But Rabbi Yehuda is much more lenient, and he says you can make a place that's fit for carrying on Shabbos, a private domain, even if you only have two partitions that are running parallel to each other. And since the second paragraph is introduced by, and furthermore, says Rav Ashi, what you know is that the rationale of the first paragraph is not the rationale of the second paragraph. In other words, if both paragraphs could be explained by Rav Yehuda holds that two partitions is enough for a private domain, then you wouldn't need the word and furthermore. So what Rav Ashi is teaching us is when somebody says and furthermore, they're trying to slip a new idea in on you. So that's when you have to really be careful. Because, and furthermore, sounds like, I'm going to give you one more idea just like the previous ideas. But in reality, when somebody says to you, and furthermore, what they're saying is, and assuming that you agree with me on this idea, now let's go to a new idea that I believe is related, but is actually a whole new realm that I want to introduce and see if I can get you to agree with me on that one too, right? It's going one more step, one more level. It is a chiddush. It is a new idea, a new rationale that is being introduced. And that's how we know that in the first paragraph, Rav Yehuda is relying on the edge of the roof descends in seals. But in the second paragraph, he's relying on the concept of, and 2 partitions is enough to define a private domain. In any case, the rabbis disagree with both rulings of Rabbi Yehuda. So it didn't become the law, but it's so important that the sages preserve these minority opinions, because you never know how conditions may change in the future, and particularly when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes, we're going to have like a whole new, sort of way of life here on earth, where God's presence will be revealed to everyone, and there are going to be certain laws that we were not able to follow during the long exile that will be possible to fulfill and observe, once the Messiah comes and God's presence is revealed throughout the world. That completes our discussion of the 5th Mishnah, of chapter 9 and chapter 9 itself. We now move on to chapter 10. Chapter 10 is going to be fun. There's going to be a lot of Mishnahs here, 19 Mishnahs in just 10 pages in chapter 10. And as Rav Steinsaltz introduces chapter 10, throughout this whole journey of Tractate Eruvin, we've been mostly studying the halachos, the laws of joining spaces together, particularly courtyards and courtyards that open into alleyways, so that carrying can be permitted on Shabbos. But this is just one class of laws that the sages decreed for the dual purpose of preventing people from performing prohibited work on Shabbos, right? To distance us from coming to violate the Torah prohibition on working on Shabbos, and to enhance the beautiful and sacred character of Shabbos. So the laws of eruv help us, keep us away from doing prohibited work and enable us to enjoy Shabbos more and to make it beautiful and sacred. But eruv isn't the only, set of laws that help us to do that. There's many others. And here at the end of Tractate Eruvin, we're going to look a little bit more at some of these other kinds of decrees that help us to enjoy Shabbos and distance ourselves from coming to perform prohibited labor. And mostly we're going to be focusing on objects that are permitted to be moved or objects that are not permitted to be moved and how we handle them. So we're going to start with Tefilllin, right? Tefilllin. These are my Tefilllin right here. This is the head Tefilllin and this is the arm Tefilllin. And we're going to be talking about Tefilllin and the case of what happens when a person finds Tefilllin that somebody dropped or lost by accident on Shabbos. Now, Tefilllin, these black straps, the strap, this is the arm Tefilllin, and it ends up getting wrapped around, if you're a right-handed person, around your left arm. As you can see, there's quite a bit of leather. There's a plastic case on top of it. And I remove the case. Then there's also like just a little shield on top of that stays on. But this piece in the mornings, when I pray, when any Jewish man prays in the mornings, I would remove my watch, right? And I'm not going to put on tefillin. I'm not going to say the bracha, of course. But just to show you a little bit, it ends up going here on the bicep, and it's the lower bicep, and we're going to discuss that in a moment. We're going to have to see the ruling. It's right here on this stuff. It goes on the lower bicep and very much on the inner arm, so that when your arm comes down to your side, you feel it against your side, and it's the lower bicep so that it is even with your heart. The tefillin is meant to be alongside the heart. Now, why is this such a sacred object that we're about to study? What happens if you find it on Shabbos? And whereas it's something that you can't use on Shabbos, we don't put on tefillin on Shabbos. So therefore, it would seem to be a muktzah item. The things that have no permitted use on Shabbos, and we don't use tefillin on Shabbos, therefore we shouldn't touch them on Shabbos. But if we find it abandoned on the street or in a field, because in this box there are sacred words in the names of God, it's like there's a little scroll contained in here The tefillin is made out of cowhide that's sort of pressed and compacted until it feels hard. It seems like hard, almost like plastic or metal, but it's actually made out of leather, and it's sewn together also with cowhide, or I'm not even sure exactly what the thread is made out of. I think sinew. But the point is that there's parchment inside with verses from the Torah that contain God's name. So it's a very, very holy object used for an important and sacred obligation. And so if you find this on the ground, you can't just leave it there the same way that you wouldn't leave a Torah scroll lying around on the ground. Nina and I were once doing research for a script, and we were interviewing members of the Satmar Hasidic community in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. We met so many wonderful, beautiful people. They were so warm and welcoming to us. Really had a wonderful experience. And one of them told us a story that some years before, by accident, somebody's tefillin, who had just put it down on a table and walked away for a moment, somehow like somebody came through and was cleaning up, and by accident, the tefillin got swept into a garbage can. And then the garbage can was emptied into the dumpster, and then the dumpster was emptied into the garbage truck. And by the time they realized that this tefillin had been lost, the tefillin were in a garbage truck on their way to the dump in Long Island or New Jersey. And they mounted a massive effort with hundreds of people involved, to search the trucks and the trains, and eventually, 100 people scouring through a dump looking for these tefillin. I mean, it's that important, that sacred of an object. Tragically, they were not able to find it in that instance. But just to give you the sense of the effort that people will go to preserve tefillin in the same way that they would go to preserve a Torah scroll. All right, let us read our Mishnah. And by the way, if you have comments or questions, please put them in the comments. Our discussion of this Mishnah is going to be not too long. And then I will come to your comments and questions. All right. Chapter 10, Mishnah number 1. One who finds tefillin outside the city on Shabbos, where they are in danger of becoming lost or damaged, brings them into his house pair by pair, by donning them in the manner in which they are typically donned for the mitzvah, right? So you can't pick them up and carry them. Assuming you're outside the city, there's no eruv, right? So carrying is not permitted. You shouldn't even be handling tefillin on Shabbos, but you want to save it, you want to preserve it. So it's like the sages are saying, okay, so first of all, you're going to be allowed to touch it so that we preserve the tefillin. You shouldn't be carrying it. So the way you're going to handle it is you're going to put it on, even though we normally don't put tefillin on Shabbos, but you're going to put it on so that you're not carrying it, rather you're wearing it. Now, tefillin is not clothing. It is not clothing, but as we've seen, you can wear jewelry on Shabbos, so it's like you're donning it not to fulfill the mitzvah of wrapping tefillin, which we do 6 days a week, with the exception of holidays, but rather you're gonna put it on yourself as an ornament just so that you can bring it to a safe place. Rabban Gamliel says he brings them in 2 pairs by 2 pairs. In other words, if he finds several sets of tefillin, right, not just the one pair with the head and the arm tefillin, but rather multiple pairs. So Rabban Gamliel says you can bring in 2 at a time. And he brings them in 2 at a time. And in what case, says the Gemara, is this statement that one is permitted to carry tefillin inside said? It is with regard to old tefillin, which have already been used and are designated for the mitzvah. However, with regard to new tefillin, as it is unclear whether they really are tefillin or merely amulets in the form of tefillin, he is exempt from performing the task. That's a little weird to me. I'm not quite sure I understand it, but it's, I guess, because there's a doubt. Maybe they're, in the old days they formed amulets that looked like tefillin, and that would not have the names of God inside. So then you don't have to worry about saving them, since there is this doubt, apparently. If one finds tefillin tied in bundles or in wrapped piles, in which case he is unable to carry them in pairs, he sits there and waits with them until dark, guarding them until the conclusion of Shabbos, and then he brings them into his house. And in a time of danger, when it is dangerous to tarry outside of town, he covers the tefillin and proceeds on his way. He's not going to risk his own safety in order to preserve these objects, even though they're so holy. Rabbi Shimon says that there is an alternative method of transferring the tefillin. One gives them to another who is less than 4 cubits from him, and the other passes to another until the tefillin reach the outermost courtyard of the city. In other words, nobody can carry an object more than 4 cubits. That's just the rule. In the public domain, you can't carry something more than 4 cubits, but you could pass from one person to another so that no individual carries them more than 4 cubits. It's like you're making like a chain, right? A chain of people who are going to pass them one to the next, almost like a bucket brigade, in order to save the tefillin. And similarly, and this is crazy, and similarly with regard to one's son who was born in a field and may not be carried on Shabbos. Right, so a baby cannot be carried on Shabbos. You can't carry, just like you can't carry things, you can't carry a person. Although, as we've seen, that once a child is like a toddler, you can carry because the toddler assists in carrying itself. But a baby, you can't carry on Shabbos. So if it's born on Shabbos, now, let me just state that, in case it's not obvious, you're not going to leave the baby on the ground where it's in some kind of danger. If there's any physical danger involved, we totally override and desecrate Shabbos in order to preserve human life. But assuming there's no issue of safety or danger, and and the baby was somehow born on the road, and now you want to get to town where you're going, how are you going to carry the baby? So one way is that you give it to one person and that person gives to another person. You kind of pass the baby along, even up to 100 people. Rabbi Yehuda says a person may even do this with a barrel, meaning it doesn't have to be something as sacred as tefillin or as beautiful and holy as a human being, but even any object. You could just, if there was some need to preserve it, you could pass it from one person to another, says Rabbi Yehuda. And even take it beyond the Shabbos limit, provided that no one person carries it more than 4 cubits. They said to him, meaning the other rabbi said to him, this barrel may not go a greater distance than the feet of its owner, i.e. it may not be carried any further than the owner may walk. Right, as we've seen before, you have a Shabbos boundary. You can't walk more than 2,000 cubits in any direction from where you established your Shabbos dwelling. So this barrel that somebody owns, it can't go farther than the person himself can go. That's the Mishnah. Okay, so that is the Mishnah. And now we start to discuss it. And so the first question that the Gemara asks is, well, the Mishnah says that one pair of tefillin may be carried by wearing it. Right? And then it says that Rabban Gamliel says 2 pairs may be carried in that way. So who is the Tana? Who is the rabbi who said that you can carry 1 pair or you can transport 1 pair on Shabbos, 1 pair of tefillin that you found out in the field by putting it on yourself, wearing it, right? Donning the tefillin, the way we wrap tefillin in the mornings. Since it's an unattributed Mishnah, the first place we go is it probably reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. Right? So Rabbi Meir is the one who was just, so brilliant and his thinking was so clear. And he was basically responsible for most of the Mishnahs where we don't have Rabbi so-and-so says this or Rabbi so-and-so says that, where the law is simply stated, that probably reflects the view of Rabbi Meir. But then the Gemara asks, well, wait a minute. Is it Rabbi Meir? We've learned elsewhere that Rabbi Meir says if a house is on fire on Shabbos, now you can't put out a fire on Shabbos. You can't start a fire and you can't put out a fire on Shabbos. So if someone's house is on fire, and he'd like to rescue objects from his house, assuming there's an eruv, right? He can carry stuff out to the courtyard. Or I guess maybe there's not an eruv, so he can't carry. And in fact, you're not allowed. There's a whole bunch of laws. I can't remember exactly right now what they are. But what's relevant here is that Rabbi Meir said, if you want to save your clothing that's in the house, and presumably there's not an eruv, right? So you can't carry your clothing out to the eruv, or I can't remember if it was that the sages decreed you're not allowed to carry things out of a burning building because you're gonna, you may endanger yourself and you might come to put out the fire and violate Shabbos in that way. But what they did say, so that it wasn't too restrictive, is that you can carry out certain things that you need. We studied this in Tractate Shabbos. Or Tractate Eruvin. We studied some months ago. You can carry out as much food as you need for that Shabbos, and you can also carry out clothes, but you can't carry them. So Rabbi Meir said what you can do is you can put on as many clothes as can go on your body. In other words, not just one layer of clothes, but as many clothes as you can throw onto your body so that you're technically wearing them. You can then wear those clothes, walk out of the house, and save your clothes from that house fire. So, if on Shabbos, where it's otherwise prohibited, but you can save clothes from this burning building by putting on a bunch of layers, and that's the view of Rabbi Meir, then why does Rabbi Meir say in our Mishnah that you can only put on one pair of tefillin? Rabban Gamliel disagrees and says you can put on two. But why does Rabbi Meir say you can only put on one? Why isn't he consistent with his view elsewhere? Well, if you're going to just put on as many clothes as you can just to save the clothes, you're obviously not wearing the clothes for real the way you would normally wear clothes. You're piling clothes onto your body, technically wearing them, but you're just really saving them from the fire. So likewise, why not put on extra pairs of tefillin onto your body so that you can save them? Why only one pair? That's the question that the Gemara is asking. And it would seem inconsistent between Rabbi Meir's view on clothing and Rabbi Meir's view on tefillin on Shabbos. Rava says, well, it's not the issue is not that Rabbi Meir is being inconsistent. It's that the objects in question are very different kinds of objects. Even normally during the week, we wear more than one article of clothing. We could easily be wearing more even than just, pants on our legs and a shirt on our top. We might have a shirt, we might have an undershirt, we might have a vest, we might have a jacket, we might have a hat. I mean, we might wear lots of articles of clothing, but when we wear tefillin, even during the week. But when we put on tefillin, there's only the arm tefillin and the head tefillin. We don't wear two pairs of tefillin during the week. Now, some will immediately think, well, wait a minute, isn't there Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin? And yes, there's a lot of very religious people who have the practice that in the morning they will put on two pairs of tefillin, but not at the same time. First, they put on their regular tefillin, then they get late in the prayer service, they remove that tefillin, and then they put on the second pair of tefillin, but they only have one pair at a time, and the second pair of tefillin is a stringency they put on themselves because there's a bit of, I'm not even sure exactly what the reasoning is, but I think it's because there's a dispute about how tefillin should be formulated, and pretty much everyone agrees that it is the way we do it, the tefillin that we wear. But just to be covered in case of the other view turns out to be correct, people will put on this second pair of tefillin that, the scrolls are just a little bit different inside. But nobody is putting on two pairs of tefillin at the same time, is what Rava is saying right here. So Rabbi Meir, if indeed it is his view in this unattributed Mishnah, he's consistent. Yes, clothes you can pile on, lots of layers of clothes to save them from a fire. But tefillin, no, you can only put on one tefillin because that's the normal way of putting it on during the week. Then the Gemara asks, well, Rabban Gamliel, who says you can put on two pairs of tefillin, where is he getting his rationale? Because if he feels like that Shabbos is not a time for tefillin. Now, there was a time when people did wear tefillin on Shabbos, right? And later the sages said, no, we don't wear tefillin on Shabbos. We don't need to wear tefillin on Shabbos because Shabbos, like tefillin, is a sign of the covenant between us and God. And so you don't need that on Shabbos. But some people disagreed with that view. So the Gemara is asking, well, is it that Rabban Gamliel felt that actually you do wear tefillin on Shabbos, and so you're wearing but no, this Gemara is saying that so Rabban Gamliel must feel that Shabbos is not a time for tefillin, and therefore, since you're not doing the mitzvah of wearing tefillin on Shabbos, you're just saving them like the clothes from a fire. That's why he says you can wear multiple pairs. But if that's how he feels, why not 3 pairs, 4 pairs, 5 pairs? Why does he say only 2? Or is he saying that Shabbos is a time for tefillin, in which case you should only be allowed to wear 1 pair? Why does he say you can wear 2 pair? Right? The Gemara is saying we don't understand what Rabban Gamliel is saying. How does he get the number 2? Where does that come from? And Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzhak explains, Rabban Gamliel agrees that Shabbos is not a time to put on tefillin. The reason he's saying that you can wear 2 pairs of tefillin is because there's room on the body for 2 pairs of tefillin. You're not wearing it to fulfill the mitzvah, but you're still going to wear it in the manner that you would wear it during the week. And even though it is not our custom to wear 2 pairs of tefillin at the same time, still you could put the tefillin on your body so that it is in the proper form on your body, and there's room for 2 pairs. How so? Okay, on the arm, there's room on the bicep. You could definitely have a couple of these boxes. Then you can just wrap the strap on your lower arm. But for the head tefillin, right? So this is the head tefillin. Normally in the morning, I would make a bracha. I put on the arm tefillin, wrap it down the arm, but not around the hand. Then I would make a bracha, say a blessing over the second part of the tefillin, the head tefillin. And then I would put it on my head. Which right now I'm just showing it to you. I'm not fulfilling the mitzvah. I'm just demonstrating. So this goes on the head right here, and you have to make sure that it's centered properly, and you keep your kippah on. But then the question is, where does it go on your head? What is the correct position? The Torah says, and I think I'm a little off center, am I not? Okay. The Torah says that the tefillin is worn. I'm sorry it's crooked. My mirror is like I can't. The camera does not work properly as a mirror. At any rate, where does it go? So the school of Menashe says here on our daf, for the arm, it goes on the lower bicep, as I demonstrated earlier tonight. For the head, the Torah says it goes between the eyes. So it's above the eyes, okay, but where? Where is the location? And so the answer is, the school of Menashe says up to the crown of the head. And what is the crown of the head? It's the fontanelle. It's the place where when a baby is born, there's a soft spot in the top of its skull. So that's the highest point that you could wear this, right? So that would be kind of up here. That's the highest point that you could wear it. And the lowest point, so if you imagine somebody with more hair than me, is the hairline. And so between the fontanelle and the hairline, there's room for 2 of these boxes, one up there and one down there. And so one person could theoretically carry tefillin, not by carrying them in his hand, but by wearing them. How do you wear tefillin? The way you wrap it during the week. The way you wrap it during the week would still create enough space so that a person could wear 2 pairs of tefillin. And that's where Rabban Gamliel gets his ruling, 2 pairs. You can carry 2 at a time by donning them in the manner that we don them during the week. That's what I've got for us today. Let's get to comments and questions. Here we go. Yosef Shum. Tefillin is also not permitted during the 3 weeks of fasting. What do you mean the 3 weeks of fasting? No, we do wear tefillin during the 3 weeks. Right. We don't wear tefillin, right? On Tisha B'Av. I think Tisha B'Av is when we wrap it in the afternoon. I didn't study this. I should just know all these things off the top of my head. I often have to look them up, things that come up once a year. My memory's not so good. But we do wrap during the 3 weeks, right? We don't, of course, put tefillin on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur. Then there's a big question about the intermediate days. Right? So the first 2 days outside of Israel of Passover and the last 2 days of Passover, those are festivals. For sure, we don't wrap tefillin. The first 2 days of Sukkot, the last 2 days of Sukkot, those are definitely a festival. We don't wrap tefillin. But there, where there's a division in the community, is whether we wrap tefillin during the intermediate days of Passover and the intermediate days of Sukkot. Some people do, some people don't. Depends on the minhag, the tradition of your family and your community. We don't on Chol HaMoed, on those intermediate days, but some people do. Lynn, is this the place that discusses the person who should pick them up by wearing them can be either male or female, or is that elsewhere in Talmud Bavli still coming up? I'm not familiar with that ruling. It wasn't on this page yet, but we're going to be talking about tefillin for a few more days because of this Mishna. So that's an interesting question. I don't remember, and I didn't read ahead, so we'll see. Brinna, does it matter if the tefillin are kosher? What if the person finding them perceives an irregularity in them, but they still have Hashem's name? That's a great question. I mean, it's not like they haven't told us what the rationale is, why we're saving the tefillin, why it's so holy. Is it because it's this holy object with which we perform a mitzvah? Is it because the scrolls inside contain verses from the Torah and God's name? We don't have the rationale yet. We've seen for sure how important it is, that we're not going to risk our lives for it, but otherwise we're going to make all kinds of arrangements. And definitely we're going to be doing something that we normally would not do. I mean, normally we would not be handling tefillin on Shabbos because it's not permitted to use on Shabbos. But here we're going to handle it and wear it, right? Don it. So it's like we're wearing it as an ornament, not as clothing, so that we can pull it in. But we haven't yet seen in our discussion, probably it's coming up, but we haven't yet seen what is the rationale. So your question is a good one. If it's because the scrolls inside, which have God's name, that's why we're saving them. Okay, so then, it wouldn't matter if there's something unkosher about the tefillin, that they're damaged for some reason. For example, I mean, they can become puzzle very easily, right? Tefillin, where these corners somehow get damaged, right? They're no longer, I don't know if the word is not kosher, but they're not permitted. You have to get them fixed. Right, you have to get them fixed. So if when they fell, and became, somehow we found them out there in the field, and we don't know how they got there, but maybe they got damaged. So if the reasoning is because these are objects needed to perform a mitzvah and they're no longer permitted for performing that mitzvah, does this permission from the sages, the exigency of saving them on Shabbos, does it still apply? We're not sure yet, so maybe we'll get that answer in the next couple of days. Lynn also says there are Kabbalists today who wear both tefillin styles at the same time. I saw photos of one active rabbi in Jerusalem doing so, not on Shabbos, of course. It's funny, like, I've never seen that. As I was saying it, I'm like, have I seen a picture of that? I'm just not familiar with it. I haven't seen it. Maybe it's possible that some people do it. Now, tefillin in the ancient world, it was used quite differently. The sages wore their tefillin. I don't know how late in the period of the sages, but definitely at some point they were wearing it all the time. Like they would, if they were walking around during the day, they were wearing tefillin. They would take it off for Shabbos. But just the way we wear tzitzis all the time, we don't wear it to bed at night. We do wear tzitzis on Shabbos. Our fringes, but back then they wore their tefillin all the time. It's been a long, long time since anybody did that. We just put it on in the morning. We say the blessing. We do use it for morning prayers. and then we take it off. And, somebody who's not in the habit of wearing tefillin. So listen, if you're a Jewish man and you've never had tefillin on, you got to let some Chabad rabbi in your region know that. And he will drive to you and make sure that you put on tefillin, and then you can say a prayer. And we're obligated to put it on every day if it's not Shabbos or a festival. So, if you've never had it on, okay, for sure you're not fulfilling your obligation to put it on every day. But the difference between never had it on and had it on at least once is a huge difference, a major, major difference. And it will count as a great merit for you, when you get to the next world. We're having this conversation earlier today. People may be familiar with Pascal's wager, right? So Pascal, he was a philosopher, mathematician. He was talking about being a person of faith. And he said, well, if I conduct myself as if my creator made me and has expectations of me, and I fulfill my obligations, and then it turns out that the world is random and there is no creator, what have I lost? I would have been a little bit more strict with myself. I would have invested time and energy in something that turned out to be not real. But, you're part of a faith community. You're going to conduct yourself as an upright person. You won't lose that much, and you probably gain quite a bit. But if it turns out that God made the world, God, gave us obligations to fulfill, and you're running your life as if you have no obligations, right? Well, either way, this life is short compared to eternal life. If there's no eternal life and you still, acted like a person of faith and fulfilled all your obligations, how much do you lose really? But if, you conducted yourself like the world is a random place and you have no eternal soul that is going to go to the next place, and your position in the next world is going to be, very much impacted by your behavior in this world, then you can lose a lot by not, opening yourself up to a life of faith and a life of fulfilling your obligations, as our forefathers, as our ancestors have passed that tradition down to us. So why take a chance is the point. Why take a chance, right? If you're a Jewish man, get tefillin on yourself at least once. And if you have a moving experience, maybe you'll then be further motivated to get yourself a pair of tefillin and put them on every day. Likewise, keeping Shabbos, it's just one of those big, it's one of the 10 commandments, right? Keeping Shabbos is part of the 10 commandments. And, stretching a little, making that effort to observe Shabbos in your life, to stop, to turn off the screens, to stop all the work, to stop the business of the week, to celebrate, to be together with your family. If you're a woman, to light the candles. If you're a man, to make the kiddush at the dinner, to do the stuff that we do. There's such a huge reward waiting for you. And there's no guarantee. No one can, prove to you that all of this is so. But if it is so, and you just neglected, it can be a big loss. So why not? You're already here. You're learning. Open yourself up to some increased observance in your life. Okay. So I'm asked, can I give a quick answer to this? Rachel Grunspan says, I don't understand. If there are so many questions, who decides which rabbi is right? What makes their decisions more important than the other, right? So when the rabbis themselves disagree, when the sages disagree, right? So when the sages disagree, at some point it was worked out which sage we follow, right? Now, not everybody got on board with the same sage. And that's why there are differences in communities, right? There's a Hasidic community, there's a Sephardic community, there's a Yeshivish Ashkenazic community. I mean, even in the Orthodox Jewish world, there are many, streams that people follow. And the answer is, really, you just got to join a community. And like if you're not in a community already, you join a community it starts to feel comfortable, and then you invest, and then you go with the rulings of that community. And then eventually over time, you start to see, well, is there, even within that community, are there some differences? It's like if you grow up religious, well, then you do what your parents do, right? And you receive the tradition from them. But if you're like us, sort of returning to Orthodox Judaism that didn't grow up in it, like Nina and I, we actually have a little bit of freedom of which community we're choosing to join and which traditions we're going to hold by. But what we can't do is just pick and choose, too much. Like, it's not like a menu and a smorgasbord. And so really you have to be consistent. And that's why one of the main teachings in Pirkei Avos, the ethics of the fathers, the chapters of the fathers, is make for yourself a Rav. Meaning, at some point, you have to submit to the authority of a rabbi, right? A modern rabbi who you can ask questions of and who has a community around him. And it doesn't mean that, you're joining a cult and submitting, subsuming all your will, nullifying your will to this community. But it means you're going to have a consistent set of practices and observances. And still many questions are going to come up. And that's why you have a Rav, so that you can ask these questions. It's amazing. We've been asking these questions for thousands of years, millions of people. And still many questions come up, either because we just don't know, or we forgot, or really is novel situations that have to be answered because they didn't exist before, because the world keeps changing, technology keeps changing, etc. So I hope that begins to answer your question, Rachel. Okay, we ran a little long. But that's what I've got for us this evening. Tomorrow, we're going to continue discussing Tefilllin in the context of Shabbos. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. Our show is at noon Pacific, like it always is on Friday. We're so excited. Shabbos is coming. This has been, quite a crazy week in the world. And the crazier the world is, the more beautiful the peace of Shabbos when it descends on us. And that's why the song that we started tonight, Boi V'Shalom, enter in peace. The Sabbath bride enters in peace. Then at our table, we welcome the angels that accompany us on Shabbos. I mean, there's this extra measure of soul and angelic energy and, and this feminine energy, the Sabbath bride. And it's just, it enfolds us in the peace of Shabbos, and we can't wait. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers.